mainstream would understand it. It's just,
I mean,
doesn't make sense.
This notion of tying somebody to a post and getting the whip and whipping them because they stole some bread or they stole an apple or some, astaghfirullah, in Islam, this is completely alien to Islam. This was a very different concept of slavery, and in Islam, this is not that. This is something completely different. Now, what Islam did, alhamdulillah, is it put a process in place that made, there was no need for slavery, and number two, one of the best ways to, one of the best ways to give charity was to go and free a slave. So some of the early companions, and if you look at the words of the Aisha radiallahu anha, the Prophet's wife, she said, may Allah be pleased with her, that it became difficult for us to go and give charity and free a slave because they'd all been freed. Okay, so Allah put a process in place where something was abolished, but it was done in a sustainable way. You can't suddenly free tens of thousands of people who now have to fend for themselves. You're not talking about a place where there's security, there's food, there's water. These are very difficult commodities to come by. And so what Islam did, alhamdulillah, is it put a process in place where it took away the need for this need for slavery of that type, of prisoners of war and what have you. But there were slaves who were born into slavery. But if you look at Islamic history, some of our rulers, the caliphs, were ex-slaves. Where in European history do you find that the slaves become the kings?
Do you know some names?
Well, it was the empire of the Mamluks, the Mamluk Empire. The rulers were ex-slaves. The lineage was slaves. If you look at, for example, Bilal, radiallahu anhu, the first person to give the call of prayer, he was given that honor. He was an ex-slave, right? And yet, because of Islam, he was freed and he was given honor and respect amongst the Sahaba. In fact, the Sahaba, many of them were much junior in terms of Bilal because he was one of the first converts, mashallah, to Islam. So he was honored and respected. The first person to have the honor of climbing on top of the Kaaba and give the call of prayer was Bilal. When the caliphs would invite people to ask questions or whatever, people would queue up. And Bilal was near the front. And one of the Sahaba said, look at our position. We were the most noble of people. Today we are queuing up behind the slaves, the ex-slaves. And one of the companions said to him, when they were called to Islam, they responded and we fought. And that is why today their position is higher to our position. This is an ex-slave, a black man that they're talking about. And these were the most noble, richest people of Mecca. And they recognized that it was Islam that elevated him beyond themselves, right? We don't see this in European history. We don't see this anywhere.
So you can say like the concept of slavery that that the mainstream would recognize today, it existed, like amongst the Arabs context that Islam came to.
Yes.
But like Islam kind of brought some process, as you said, of easing out of it.
Yes.
Sustainable.
And that was 14 centuries ago. Now, if we look at modern European history, and slavery being abolished in the 18th century, it very much coincides with the Industrial Revolution, right? Coincidentally, now you've got machinery to do all the work, and now it becomes cheaper to have the machinery than have the slave, and now this huge abolition movement comes about. Now, I'm not saying everyone who wanted slavery abolished was just doing it for the money. There were very good people, and there were Christians who were at the forefront of the abolition movement. But what I'm trying to say to you is that message resonated with people because they could see economic benefits now for not having slavery. Do you see my point?
Yeah.
So this notion of the Western Enlightenment, and we were so good that we decided that we intellectually and morally decided that we were going to give up slavery. There may have been people that did that.
Have you got any material? Have you read any material on it?
I've read it.
Like, give some solid kind of
so there's
evidence about for that theory?
Yeah, there's lots of stuff. If you go and read, I can't quote it because it's years ago I read it, but if you actually go and look, there are lots of studies done about this that actually show that this was not just some good feeling towards our black man and realizing that we've created an injustice to our black brothers and sisters in Africa. This was an economic influence because it was very expensive to buy a slave. It was, I think, the slaves would sell for like £500, £200, £300. In those days, that was a lot of money. You could buy a house for that money. But they were then bred like cattle, and their children would be born into slavery. And the master, if he did have sexual relations with his slaves, which he did, by the way, often, which was rape, if she refused, he would rape her. Islam prohibited that. The children would still be born into slavery. Islam said no, the children will be free. They're his children. And she, when he dies, will be freed. So there was a process put there, you see, in place.
Sorry, can you say that last bit again?
So
if you own a slave and they have children.
So if, for example, you had what your right hand possessed through war, and you had children with this woman, the children would be born free. And when you die, she has to be freed. So she would be introduced back into society. And within a few generations, nobody would even know that you were a slave or he was a slave. You'd just be an average, normal person. And you may be richer and more successful than me. Now, where do we find this in Western history? So really, I think the saying, don't throw stones if you live in glass houses. I think this really does apply here.
I mean, to be honest, I'm not coming at it as a defensive position. I'm looking to understand my own faith and to get.
MashaAllah, it's a good question. Yeah. And I think what I would urge brothers and sisters to realize is that whenever anyone wants to criticize something that was happening in the 7th century, they need to do two things. Number one, they need to establish what they are on is the truth. Okay, so if their view has to be defended on first principles, that it is a fact what they're saying, that's the first thing. Otherwise, it's just a good, because my community feel this,
pop culture, basically.
Because I feel this, then it's right. Well, that's not really, that you can't say you cannot then argue as an absolute that what you're saying is 100% true. That's the first thing. The second thing is don't fall into the fallacy of presentism. Don't judge what was happening in the 7th century with what you have today. Because what you have today is very different from what they had in the 7th century.
Yeah. But of course, there's some things which they have to apply, like if they applied back then, it applies today consistently. But, taking into consideration translation for different contexts. Because
what the ulama do, what the scholars do, even if there is something at a time where it was allowed to do, and it may have been beneficial for those people, if the circumstances change and now it becomes detrimental, the scholars could say it's better not to do this now, because the purpose of why it was introduced was to create ease, to relieve a problem, not to create a problem. So the scholars may say that now it's created a problem, but this does not apply to our mainstream Sharia of how to pray, how to fast, how to perform all of our obligations. This is the peripheral concepts. And some of those peripheral concepts, today with the circumstances changing, the scholars and our governments may decide that it's actually detrimental to do this now. And so it's better not to do it. It's not necessarily about haram and halal. It's about using your hikmah. Does this solve a problem or does it create a problem? Now this does not mean if I read my salah and it's creating a problem, I don't have to read my salah. That's not what it means, because that's a farad. That's a pillar of your religion. You have to do that. Even if you are semi-conscious on your bed, you have to move your eyes. And if you can't move your eyes, you have to think that you're praying your salah, but you have to pray. But we're talking about other aspects that are not haram or halal to do necessarily, or not compulsory to do, let's put it that way. That's a better way of putting it. They're not compulsory to do, but they're necessary in a particular situation. If the situation changes, then the scholars will say this is better not to do. And that's the beauty of Islam, that it is not, it has rigidity where rigidity is needed. We don't compromise on certain things. What Allah has made haram, we cannot make halal. What Allah has made halal, we don't make haram. But if something was halal at a certain time, and it was there to solve a problem, to solve a need, and now it's causing a problem, and it's not doing what it was designed to do, then the scholars will say, even though it was lawful to do, now it is better that you don't do it, because it has an adverse effect on society, an adverse effect on people, an adverse effect upon Islam maybe. You understand? So this is the beauty of Islam. Alhamdulillah.
Jazak Allah.
Assalamu alaikum, brother. Jazak Allah Khair. Assalamu alaikum. You're live.